afraid that I couldn't avoid using this little picture here, the image of a person who didn't like the candidate that got elected. Of course, the intensity of this, you would say, mindless rage is very telling, even more so in this little video showing it. And really, this is just a consequence of placing so much trust in people and politics. And you know, by the same token, the opponents of Jesus, what we see here in today's passage, the scribes and the Pharisees, they get to be in a state of mindless rage about the possibility of him gaining, the vote from the populace. And they're very embarrassed. They are so used to the hold and the control that they have over the people. And of course, Jesus is kind of confronting and confounding that control. He's bringing to the people a refreshing freedom and this hope to the people of God. But you see, when a person's power is threatened, look out for the repercussions. And from these chapters, we are seeing Jesus not only undermining the religious leaders' teaching on the Sabbath, but also affirming here something about himself that really goes way beyond him being merely another man. And using the baseball analogy, which is what I'm going to use this morning, the scribes and Pharisees respond. And in this passage, they respond by swinging at him, this baseball analogy, swinging at him 3 times, but they're the ones that are in the end are struck out. So let's look at our first swing. This Sabbath challenge coming from the Pharisees is following immediately after Jesus' teaching about, if you remember, new wine in old wineskins. Right? That is significant given the dispute here over Sabbath regulations. The disciples' action, here we see they're gathering, they're processing grain on the Sabbath and eating it. It actually becomes a concrete demonstration of this incompatibility with the old. The disciples are actually doing what is in direct violation of the old covenant law. Namely, that on the Sabbath, you are to rest from your labour. They wouldn't even let you go out and buy takeaway food on the Sabbath. So clearly, gathering heads on the Sabbath, rubbing to get the grain, is violation of the Sabbath principle. Here we see it in Exodus chapter 34. You shall work 6 days, but on the 7th day you shall rest. Even during ploughing time and harvest, you shall rest. Even as God has provided manna for the Israelites in the desert, they were specifically commanded not to gather any manna on the Sabbath. They were to collect double on the previous day, on the Friday. So they would then bake that manna, they would give it to their families on the Friday, but also then they had enough to give it to their families on the Sabbath, on the Saturday. Specifically so that no work, no gathering, no processing would take place on the Sabbath. Exodus 16. Now it happened that on the 6th day, they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for each one. Then all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses. And he said to them, this is what Yahweh has spoken. Tomorrow is a Sabbath observance, a holy Sabbath to Yahweh. Bake what you will bake and boil what you will boil, and all that is in excess put aside to be kept until tomorrow. So they put it aside until morning, as Moses had commanded, and it did not become foul, nor was there any worm in it. And Moses said, eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to Yahweh. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather it, but on the 7th, the Sabbath, there will be none. And interestingly enough, some were not content to simply refrain from gathering on the Sabbath, but we find God was not pleased with their disobedience. Now it happened on the seventh day that some of the people went out to gather, but they found none. Then Yahweh said to Moses, "How long do you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws? See, Yahweh has given you the Sabbath. Therefore he gives you bread for 2 days on the 6th day. Remain every man in his place. Let no man go out of his place on the 7th day." So the people rested on the 7th day. In our passage before us, it is clear that the disciples could have waited until the following day, but it would not actually surprise me to find out that Jesus instructed them to pick and rub heads of the grain and to eat. I mean, whether he did so or not is really irrelevant. The fact that he did not object to it was proof enough that he approved. But this action violated the Sabbath law precisely because it constituted work. Jewish law prohibited harvesting, threshing, winnowing on the Sabbath. And the disciples' actions encompassed multiple prohibited categories. The point is precisely in the fact that Jesus is signalling a fundamental change here. Jesus brings a new reality of salvation into the present, and the old and the new are irreconcilable opposites. The attempted combination produces explosive consequences like new wine in old wineskins. She's a popper. Jesus moves past the law's framework altogether, not necessarily by violating its spirit, but fulfilling its deepest purpose, rendering the external structures unnecessary. And the distinction matters enormously. A new relationship has been established between God and man, no longer governed through the law, but through Jesus himself and the kingdom that is breaking into the world through him. We notice food laws were dismissed by Jesus, and he made it clear that no one could be defiled or made unclean by food. So the new era of what we call messianic salvation has arrived. He annuls the whole tradition of ceremonial observance. And on his own authority alone, Jesus sets aside the principle of ceremonial impurity, embodied in much of the Mosaic legislation. That old covenant framework itself becomes obsolete through the arrival of what it itself had anticipated and spoke about, the arrival, fulfillment of Jesus, the Messiah. So here now, instead of refuting the Pharisees' point about violating the Sabbath, Jesus points to the precedence of what King David had done. You see, David violated the law too, and he brings this point out. So Jesus didn't refute their point about violating the Sabbath. What the disciples did violate the Sabbath technically. From the Old Testament standpoint, of course, they were right. However, they were wrong because they misread what God was now doing in bringing in the long-awaited kingdom, the kingdom that had come with Jesus. And they'd missed the importance of who stood before them right now. And Jesus answered and said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God. He took and ate the consecrated bread, which is not lawful for any to eat except the priests alone, and gave it to his companions." See, David was a key figure in the Old Testament. He was the ideal king, and the prophecies surrounding him were clearly established there in the Old Testament. David received what we call the Davidic covenant, this special covenant. And Israel knew that the Messiah would be a son of David. They understood that this son of David would have an eternal kingdom. To state what should have been obvious about himself, Jesus points to David, what he did when he and his men were hungry. They went to the priest and they received the bread of the presence from the tabernacle, which was only lawful for the priests themselves to consume. And Scripture gave no hint whatsoever that David and his men violated God's will. The narrative actually implies divine approval there in the Old Covenant. And so it became this authorized exception to the rule, attributed to David's special standing as God's anointed king. And the reason? David stood for something dramatic that was happening in the process of the history of salvation. He is unique. And even these Pharisees, they knew that what David had done was not a violation of God's will. It was kind of like an exception to the norm. And the reason is simply that David was no ordinary figure and that he was unique in the history of God's purposes. So Jesus' point to these Pharisees is that David and his men were hungry, and that superseded the law because of who he is in the scheme of God's purposes. Now, of course, what they failed to observe, however, is that this Jesus who is standing before them is even more unique in the scheme of God's salvation purposes. And for this reason, he is above the Sabbath. As he says here, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So he is over the Sabbath. He is, in fact, the author of the Sabbath, isn't he? If we go to Christian theology. But he stands over it. He is above it. As something interesting, I'd like to point out a little extra piece that we find in only one other place in the Synoptic Gospels, and that is Matthew alone. He adds this here to this section, where he says, or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple break the Sabbath and are innocent? Why? Because they're actually working on the Sabbath. That's their role, right? And then Jesus says, but I say to you that something greater than the temple is here. If you had known what this means, I desire compassion and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the innocent. Jesus, of course, would have had much more to say as he was teaching on this and as he confronted the scribes and Pharisees, even more than probably the gospel writers had written. But they, of course, selected part of what Jesus was saying to make their point to the people they were writing to. So, of course, Matthew, in writing to Jews, has included this portion of the temple because having Jesus even greater than the temple would really draw the attention of the Jewish community to that point, because the temple was right on the top of their list of priorities. But Jesus is even greater than the temple. Now, of course, it makes the same point that Mark and Luke are making. It reinforces the same truth, because even Matthew himself quotes what Jesus says, for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. Now, I want to make another observation about this statement, Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, because some within the broader Christian tradition will combine the word Lord and Sabbath and bring it to mean that that's a Saturday. The Lord's Day, then, is a Saturday. So in the book of Revelation, for example, they would say that John was in the Spirit on the Saturday, right? I was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day, says John, and I heard behind me a loud voice like a trumpet. So, bringing these two words together from our passage today, Lord and Sabbath, Jesus, Lord of the Sabbath, they would say that John's meaning here that he was in the Spirit on the Saturday. Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath, Saturday. John is in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. That must mean a Saturday, right? That's the logic. But really, it's an exegetical salad. And got verses here plucked out of context, run together, really to become a toss salad. The first day of the week in the Jewish calendar was actually a Sunday. The Sabbath was the last day of their week. Look what Luke says in chapter 24. Now on the first day of the week, Sunday, at early dawn, they came to the tomb bringing spices which they had prepared. The first day is the day Jesus rose from the dead. Sunday meetings reflected this. Rather than meeting on the Sabbath, the tradition in the church became to meet on the first day, the Lord's day of his resurrection. So we can look at some verses here. In the book of Acts, Paul says, on the first day of the week when we were gathered together to break bread. They took communion as they gathered as the church on the first day of the week, which was Sunday. Or in 1 Corinthians 16, on the first day of every week, each of you is to set aside something saving whatever he has prospered. So the evidence suggests Sunday is the day that the early church met for worship and to break bread together. It's the day of Jesus' resurrection. So the Lord's Day is a Sunday, and we've got to say it's not good exegesis to suggest that combining Lord and of the Sabbath in any way suggests that Saturday is the Lord's Day. So we saw that the Pharisees took a swing at Jesus and they actually struck out on their first accusation. Once again, they're prepping themselves to take another swing at him. Again, Luke says, this time on another Sabbath, they were watching him closely that they might believe in him. Bump. Are you listening? No, definitely not. So that they might find reason to accuse him. Now, I find this staggering. Can you believe it? Now, it reminds me of the man begging at the temple gate called Beautiful. And through Peter, of course, the resurrected Jesus heals that crippled man there. And because of this, plus because of the teaching of Peter and John, they are arrested and put into prison. And they're brought before the council. And Peter then makes this definitive statement. And there is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name under heaven that has been given among men by which we must be saved. And so here they are in this arena of judgment. And the healed man is standing right there before them as witness. And the council has nothing to say in reply. But in light of this, listen to how the council dismissed the matter and what they decided on doing. Here it is. What should we do with these men? For the fact that a noteworthy sign has happened through them is apparent, get this, is apparent to all who live in Jerusalem, and in red there, we cannot deny it. Wow. And look what they say then. Oh, but lest it spread any further among the people, let us warn them to speak no longer to any man in this name. And when they had summoned them, they commanded them not to speak or teach at all in the name of Jesus. That's unbelievable. And here in today's passage, Luke notes that they were watching him closely so that they might find reason to accuse him. That was their motive. Not that they might find reason to believe in him, it was to find reason to accuse him. Boy, they don't sound like men of integrity, like men who are seeking the truth, like men seeking God's will. They are men stuck in their own biased and selfish view. And when it's all said and done, at the base of sin, you know what's there? The desire for power. Power. Whether it's the power to control other people or even the power to control one's own destiny. At root, it's power. And when that power is challenged, what do people do? They dig their heels in. They neither humble themselves nor do they surrender. They go into the trenches. You know that metaphor, World War I, II, in the trenches fighting? They go into the trenches. And even when the truth is staring them in the face, they will not flinch, but stubbornly cling to their God-forsaking desire for their own power. So we're now in the synagogue, and there's a man there with a withered hand, all crippled up. Jesus could sense the vibe. He could read the room, and he understood what the scribes and Pharisees were thinking. Kind of reminds me of the man, remember him who was lowered down through the roof to Jesus, and there we read that Jesus knew their reasonings, what they were thinking. And so when Jesus calls the man forward, there must have been great anticipation. Those there who were humble, excited about the Messiah Jesus being there, were excited about another divine healing. But the willfully stubborn, looking for every word uttered, every action taken to use in order to take Jesus down. But Jesus didn't just heal him. What's he do? He first brings up a question, no doubt aimed at those who opposed him. And this is the question here. Jesus puts to them, I ask you, is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath? To save a life or to destroy it? Now, this is what we call a gotcha question, designed really to lock his opponents into an inescapable corner. So he kind of frames this as a binary choice, an either or, where any direct answer really is going to demolish their position. So there's really only one question. It's expressed in two, but it's really only one. So to save goes with do good, and to destroy goes with do harm. So two questions, but really only one. But they had three options. They could choose to save, thereby would be granting Jesus full permission to heal the man's withered hand on the spot, on the Sabbath, completely dismantling their obsession about Sabbath law. Or they could choose destroy. That's a real daft choice, because they would be publicly condemning themselves. I mean, no religious leader could openly declare that God's holy Sabbath was designed for doing evil or in destroying human life. But they had a third option. They could plead the fifth. Know what I mean by that? The good old US Constitution, the Fifth Amendment, the right to remain silent. And that's just what they do. They remain silent, simply because either choice would not work in their favour. And so in their mind, the man's hand wasn't an immediate life or death emergency, and they would reason to themselves, well, wait until tomorrow. The man won't die today. Heal him on the Sunday to the Friday, but do nothing on the Sabbath. Jesus utterly rejects this passive do-nothing stance. The real sting of Jesus' question is shown up as a stark, immediate contrast in the synagogue. What Jesus is preparing to do on the Sabbath is to do good and to save life by restoring the man's withered hand. What the Pharisees are actively doing on the Sabbath, they're watching Jesus with malice, plotting an accusation, seeking a way to destroy him. And they're doing it on the Sabbath. These people call themselves holy. So Jesus exposes their hypocrisy here to the entire synagogue. While accusing him of breaking the Sabbath by upholding life, they're actively breaking the Sabbath in their hearts by seeking to destroy life. They want Jesus dead. Their complete silence in response proves that the gotcha question worked perfectly. So we see that scribes, the Pharisees, took a second swipe at Jesus. They struck out with their act of malice. But once again, however, they're prepping themselves to take another swing at him. And this time, it's about conspiracy to murder. The healing that follows, the man's hand was completely restored. Now, I do want you to notice that this healing was public and visible. It's an important aspect to understand about the miracles of Jesus. There was no surrounding of ambiguity. They were never challenged as to their veracity. Even the Jerusalem council, they testified that a miracle had occurred and they could not deny it. You see, the miracles of Jesus were never a thing which raised doubts about their authenticity. We need to understand that well. So here's a bit of a picture of a person's withered hand, all crippled up. And before them all in the synagogue, his hand was restored to normal. And it proves the claim, doesn't it? If Jesus truly possesses lordship over the Sabbath, he truly possesses divine authority. And so this transforms the controversy from a legal dispute into a revelation of who this person is, this Jesus, his identity, his mission. And furthermore, we see he stands as the one who determines how God's laws function. So Mark alone records these words. And Jesus was saying to them, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. So what was the response here from the scribes and the Pharisees to the man's hand being completely restored? Was it awe and wonder? Was it amazement? Were they beside themselves with joy and excitement about what's happening? None of the above. But they themselves, it says, were filled with rage and were discussing together what they might do with Jesus. The Net Bible brings this word rage out well. Here in verse 11, the Net Bible puts it this way, but they were filled with mindless rage and began debating with one another what they would do to Jesus. This word, mindless rage, can mean fury, folly, foolishness, want of understanding, stupidity. The word is anoia, and it comes from the root word nous, meaning mind. So it comes from that word. It means anoia, means a negating of the mind. So when you put an A in front as a negative prefix, it takes on the sense of mindless stupidity. Old English translations like the King James Bible use the translation madness. They're not far off it there with madness. And I think the tone of these religious leaders is one here of infuriation to the point of being irrational. Right? They're being filled with lunacy in their demeanor towards and in their hatred of Jesus. They're showing a form of insanity as it comes to their response to him. The reason? They had no place to turn. It was checkmate. It was checkmate. 3 times they'd had a swing at him. 3 times they were struck out. Now they're benched with no home runs. All they can do now is try to find a way to get rid of him. Not to deal justly with him, not to reason with him, not even attempt to understand him. But all their evil intent had failed on 3 fronts. They made themselves look foolish by clinging to old wineskins and by refusing to consider that they might be wrong. You know, as an important note, the passage today is not simply a matter of Jesus trying to correct their poor understandings or their poor interpretations. Jesus is not offering here a better interpretation of Sabbath rules. He is making a royal, Christological claim. Right? If the anointed King David had authority to transcend a ceremonial law, how much more does the ultimate Davidic king, the Son of Man, possess absolute authority over the law itself? Furthermore, If this Jesus is able to demonstrate divine authority by healing a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath, it indeed proves that he is Lord of the Sabbath. Amen.